Man with a gun. It was the middle of quarantine, one of those long, isolating nights where everything felt off-kilter. I was in my room upstairs, drowning myself in video games with the volume cranked up high, trying to forget how quiet the rest of the house was. That's when I thought I heard something, just a faint noise coming from downstairs. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just my imagination, a byproduct of too many late nights. But the sound lingered in my mind, so I paused the game, muted the TV, and listened closely. Nothing. With a shrug, I went back to playing, convincing myself it was nothing more than the house settling. An hour passed, and then I heard it again, this time louder, more distinct. My heart rate quickened, and that sense of unease crept in. I couldn't ignore it now. Something was off. Determined to reassure myself, I set down the controller and reluctantly made my way downstairs. The house was eerily quiet. I was almost sure the sound had come from the basement. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob for a moment before I pulled it open. As soon as the door swung wide, a blast of cold air hit me. At the bottom, I saw it. The basement window was wide open, but that didn't make any sense. I knew I'd closed and locked all the windows in the house. I felt a rising sense of dread, and an almost overwhelming urge to bolt back upstairs, to get out of there. But then something made me stop. As I turned to leave, I noticed the closet door in the corner, slightly cracked open just enough to see the darkness inside. I hadn't noticed it before, hadn't even given it a second thought, but now it was all I could focus on. My mind raced, debating what to do. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, paralyzed, staring at that thin crack of darkness. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was stupidity, but eventually, I moved closer. My heart was hammering in my chest as I reached out, my hand trembling as it grasped the cold metal of the doorknob. The moment my fingers wrapped around it, I heard a sound. A low, rasping crackle from inside the closet. That was all it took. I tore up the stairs, adrenaline surging through me. I locked the basement door behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Without hesitating, I grabbed my phone and called the police, barely able to form a coherent sentence. They must have sensed the urgency, because they arrived within minutes. When they got to the house, they moved quickly, systematically clearing each room. I stayed upstairs, waiting, listening. Then, barely 5 minutes into their search, I heard it, a gunshot from downstairs. My stomach dropped, and my entire body went cold. A few minutes later, the police came up, dragging a man in handcuffs. He was disheveled, wild-eyed, his clothes filthy and torn. The look in his eyes was something I'll never forget. Deranged, desperate. The officer told me that when they opened the closet door, the man had been crouched inside, armed with a gun. He'd fired a shot at them but missed. Thankfully, they were able to disarm him and take him into custody. I stood there in shock, barely able to process what had just happened. The police left with the man, but the most terrifying part of the whole ordeal hit me later. How close I had been to opening that closet door myself. How close I had come to staring into the eyes of a man who could have ended my life, and I'll never forget how I stood there for what felt like a lifetime, deciding whether or not to open that door. I shudder when I think about what would have happened if I had. I can't believe what happened. When I first signed up to be an over-the-road trucker, I imagined adventure. I thought I'd get to see the country, explore new places, and come home with stories to share. I was right about one thing. I've got stories. But now, I'm not so sure anyone would believe them. Hell, sometimes I don't believe them. Let me start from the beginning. My name's John, I'm 23, and I've been driving for a few months now with a major company. I'll spare you the name. Trust me, it's for the best. In the time I've been out here on my own, I've seen some things that make me wonder if I'm losing my mind. The road can do that to you, especially when you're out in the middle of nowhere, driving through places like Highway 50, otherwise known as the loneliest road in America. It's a real place, out in the barren stretches of Nevada, where it's just you, the road, and the desert. That's where it happened. It was nearly midnight, and I was on my way to a truck stop about an hour away. I was exhausted, fighting to stay awake. The cold air blasting through the vents was the only thing keeping me from drifting off. You don't know true fatigue until you've driven a rig for hours on end with nothing but darkness and an empty road stretching in front of you. Then, out of nowhere, something darted across the road. It was so fast I barely had time to register what I saw. Something large, white, and low to the ground. Maybe a dog? I couldn't tell. It vanished into the brush before I could get a good look. I told myself it was just an animal. I've seen plenty of creatures scurry across the highway at night, and usually I don't give them a second thought. But less than a minute later, my truck jerked violently to the left, as if something had slammed into the side. I fought to keep control, gripping the wheel, my heart racing as I swerved back into my lane. Once I'd slowed down, I pulled over at the next turnout to inspect the damage. I jumped out of the cab and walked around to the passenger side. That's when I saw it. A massive dent in the side of the trailer. It was huge, at least 5 feet wide, but there was no clear shape to it. Just a deep, concave mark that shouldn't have been there. My mind raced. Had I hit something? A boulder, maybe? But the desert was flat. No hills, no cliffs nearby. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel behind me. I spun around and my stomach dropped. Standing about 50 feet away was something. It was huge, easily the size of a bear. But it wasn't a bear. It looked like a dog at first glance, but wrong, very wrong. It stood on 2 short, thick legs, its arms long and muscular, hanging past its knees. Its broad shoulders heaved with every breath, like it had just run miles. And its face was the worst part. The head was shaped like a wolf's, but its snout was too long, too sharp. And its eyes, those eyes were pure black, gleaming with something primal, something hungry. I was frozen, my mind blank with terror. The creature stared back at me, its chest rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. It was standing between me and my truck, my only way out. I don't know what possessed me, but after what felt like hours of silence, I managed to choke out, "You are one ugly motherfucker." For a second, it didn't move. Then, to my surprise, it snarled, but instead of charging at me, it turned. Slowly, it dropped onto all fours and lumbered off into the darkness. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. The second it was gone, I sprinted to the front of my truck, flung myself into the cab, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a minute to even start the engine. When I finally did, I floored it, though that's easier said than done in an 18-wheeler. I drove like my life depended on it, because for all I knew, it did. About half an hour later, I pulled into the truck stop. I parked, shut everything down, and tried to calm my racing heart. I wanted to believe it was over, that the nightmare was behind me. But every sound that night, every creak of the truck, every distant engine noise, had me jumping. I barely slept, terrified that thing would show up again, lurking just outside the window. I've been driving for months now, and I've had a few strange encounters, but nothing comes close to what I saw that night in Nevada. Sometimes I try to tell myself it was just my tired brain playing tricks on me, that I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the dent in the trailer, and the footsteps behind me, and that creature standing in the moonlight, watching me. I've got more stories, but I think I'll stop here for now. All I can say is, be careful out there. You never know what's really lurking on those empty roads. The lake. A few years ago, when our daughter was just a toddler, my wife and I had a favorite spot. A peaceful lake not far from home, where we'd go to escape the noise of the world. It was a quiet place, tucked away from crowds. We'd pack a picnic, let our daughter splash in the shallows, and just enjoy the stillness. One afternoon, we did just that. Spread out a blanket, ate lunch, and watched our daughter play by the edge of the water. After we finished eating, my wife decided to take a quick swim while I stayed behind with our little girl. I remember watching her walk out into the lake. Everything felt normal, perfect even. But then she stopped suddenly. She turned back to me, her smile gone, her face different. At first, I couldn't hear what she was saying over the sounds of the water lapping at the shore, but there was an urgency in her voice that made my heart skip a beat. Then I heard her clearly. I think I just stepped on someone's face. I stood there, frozen, thinking it was some kind of weird joke. But she wasn't laughing. The look in her eyes was unsettling, a kind of fear I'd never seen in her before. Her movements were quick as she waded back toward the shore, her legs kicking up water like she couldn't get out fast enough. I ran to meet her as she reached the edge, her breathing fast, hands shaking. "I'm not kidding," she said, her voice low and shaky. "I stepped on something soft, something that felt like a face." At first, she'd thought it was just a rock, maybe a patch of seaweed that brushed her foot the wrong way. But when she pressed down with her toes, she felt it. The distinct outline of a nose, the curve of an eye socket. She swore she felt the hollowness of it beneath the water. Part of me wanted to go into the lake and check for myself, but something about her fear made me hesitate. My gut churned with unease, a sick feeling that told me it was better to leave it alone. We packed up our things in a hurry, threw everything into the car, and left the lake without looking back. The next day, the news confirmed what we had been too scared to face. A young boy, missing for several days, had been found in that lake. He had drowned, and his body had likely been submerged beneath the surface the entire time we were there. The spot where they found him? It was near exactly where my wife had been swimming. To this day, my wife can't shake the feeling that she stepped on him, that in those brief, horrifying seconds, her foot brushed against the face of a child who had been lost to the water. It haunts her, and I can't say it doesn't haunt me too. Creepy family. A few years back, when I was around 18 or 19, I had an experience that still haunts me to this day. I grew up in Nebraska, in the largest city in the state, but that doesn't mean much. It's still surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat. As the city expanded, rich families started building massive homes right at the edge, where the city began to blur with the countryside. One of my closest friends lived in one of those big houses, right on the border between the city and the farmland. It became our go-to spot for hanging out. We'd ride 4x4S, hang out in the hot tub, or binge-watch reality TV in their massive living room. His parents were laid back, the kind who didn't mind us drinking as long as we stayed over. We spent a lot of time there, especially at night, even though the surrounding darkness always creeped me out. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the property was surrounded by thick trees. I'd learned to avoid going outside after dark. To get to his place, you had to drive down this long, winding two-way road that cuts through dense woods. The road wasn't well lit, just an occasional street lamp, and it passed by one of the city's largest cemeteries. I won't lie, I hated that part of the drive. It always gave me a bad feeling, and more than once, I'd sped through it just to get past as quickly as possible. On this particular night, it was spring, perfect weather. I had my windows down, music playing, enjoying the breeze as I made my way to my friend's place. It was around 10 p.m., and as I rounded a bend, something made me slam on the brakes. In the middle of the road, about 50 yards ahead, was a family. Now picture this. It's pitch black, with nothing but my headlights cutting through the darkness. And out of nowhere, there's this family just walking down the center of the road. I remember a tall, slim woman, an average-sized man, and a kid, maybe around 8 years old. The weirdest part? The woman was pushing a stroller, but there was no baby in sight. They weren't wearing anything unusual, just normal clothes, but they were walking in complete silence, without even a flashlight. I turned my music down, trying to hear if they were talking, but there was nothing, just eerie silence. The hairs on my arms stood up. I stopped my car and waited. expecting them to step aside, or at least acknowledge me. But they didn't. They didn't react at all, like I wasn't even there. It felt so wrong, so surreal. Before I had time to process it, the entire family stopped walking at the exact same moment. Then, slowly, they all turned to face me, like they'd rehearsed it. My heart dropped. I couldn't even bring myself to focus on their faces. It was like my mind was screaming for me to leave now. I didn't hesitate. I threw my car into reverse, practically slamming the pedal, and sped backward down the road, heart pounding in my chest. I barely kept control of the car, nearly running it off the road in my rush to turn around. The last thing I noticed was that the stroller, it was completely empty. I drove like hell until I made it back to a main road. The whole way, I checked my rearview mirror again and again, expecting to see them behind me. But they were gone. Just gone. When I finally made it to my friend's house, I told him and his family what happened. They gave me this weird look, like they didn't believe a word I was saying. I dropped it, feeling like I was losing my mind. Whenever I tell this story, I usually get one of three reactions. People think I'm making it up, they think I'm crazy, or they've had something similar happen to them. Honestly, I don't care if anyone believes me. I know what I saw. Hunting in the woods. A few years back, I held a hunting lease on a piece of land deep in middle Georgia. It was an old hunting camp, long abandoned and tucked away miles down an overgrown dirt road. The place was so isolated, you could easily forget the rest of the world existed. It was, without a doubt, the most secluded place I had ever been. I'm not one to buy into superstitions or ghost stories, but this camp, it had an unsettling energy. The camp itself was surrounded by thick, endless woods. There was a locked gate at the entrance to the property, and a small, worn-out cabin sat in the middle of the clearing. More than once, we found the front door wide open, even though we were sure we had locked it before leaving. That alone was eerie enough, but it wasn't what really stuck with me. One particular evening, I went out to hunt solo near a small valley that ran along a creek bordering the property. We had set up a food plot there, and it was usually a good spot. From the moment I sat down in the stand, though, I felt off. I was armed with my .308, loaded with ballistic tipped rounds. But for the first time, I didn't feel like the top predator out there. There was an unnerving sense that I wasn't alone, even though there was no sign of anyone or anything nearby. The forest was alive with its usual chorus of birds and critters, the normal symphony of the evening settling in. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. Completely. Not a single bird chirped, not a rustle in the leaves. Nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when the feeling hit me. I felt exposed, like something was watching me, and whatever it was, it didn't belong. It was getting dark, and I decided it was time to pack up and head back to the cabin. I started walking, the quiet pressing down on me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my nerves. But about 100 yards from the cabin, that feeling came rushing back, stronger this time. I felt it before I heard anything. Something was behind me. I spun around, my rifle up, and stared down the path. That's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the trail, just barely visible in the fading light, was something. It wasn't a person, but it didn't look like a deer or any other animal I'd ever seen. It stood upright, bipedal, but its shape was all wrong. It was tall, hunched slightly, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. In the dim light, I couldn't make out any real details, but there was no mistaking it. It was staring right at me. For a moment, we just stood there, locked, in this bizarre, terrifying standoff. I didn't move. I didn't dare breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about it added up. It was like some twisted half deer, half something else that shouldn't exist. Then I bolted. I turned and hurried back toward the cabin, never daring to look back. I packed my gear in record time, threw everything into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back after that night. I let the lease run out, and that was the end of it. Whatever I saw out there, I didn't want to see again. I still can't explain what it was. An animal, a trick of the fading light, or something else entirely. But one thing's for sure. It didn't belong in those woods, and I wasn't sticking around to find out more. Unsettling Grindr hookup story. I'm a 24-year-old guy living in France. I'm bisexual and have a few regular partners, so I don't use dating apps like Grindr too often. But the other night, I got a message from someone new. From the start, something felt off. His photos were overly airbrushed, and he wasn't really my type, and just something about them didn't sit right. The conversation was odd, too. He was direct, almost robotic, with weirdly personal details, talking about how he felt lonely and needed company. He was pushing for a hookup right away. I told him I was busy with work, but he kept pressing. At first, I was flattered. Then it got annoying. But instead of blocking him like I should have, I kept the conversation going, and that's where I made a huge mistake. By the time it was really late, probably past 2 a.m., I noticed more messages from him. He asked if I'd changed my mind. I tried to steer the conversation away, but he was persistent, really fixated on meeting. Then, out of nowhere, he tells me he's only about 100 meters away, staying at a place just down the block. At this point, I'm thinking, it's late, I'm bored, and he doesn't know where I live, so what's the harm? I figured it was safer because I'd be going to him and not the other way around. I couldn't have been more wrong. It's this dingy, hostel-style lodge, the kind of place tourists on a tight budget would stay. It's run down with cheap private rooms. I hesitate at the entrance, telling myself I could still turn around, but I keep going. Stupidly. I finally get inside the dimly lit hallway. I make my way up several flights of stairs to the room number he gave me. The door is slightly ajar, and there's no light inside. At this point, everything in me is screaming to leave, but I don't. I step closer, push the door open. The room is small. Dirty bathroom, towels strewn everywhere, a bed, and a closet. There's a TV mounted above the bed, but it's off. Then I hear it. A muffled voice saying, "Come in." I freeze just inside the doorway. "Hello?" I call out, but all I hear again is, "Come in." It's creepy, like he's speaking through clenched teeth or something. I can't see anyone, and my heart starts racing. I glance back at the hallway, considering bolting, but then I notice movement in the corner. A shape emerges from the darkness. The guy steps out, and he's nothing like his photos. He's massive, easily 6'4", bulky and dripping wet, wearing nothing but a soaked t-shirt clinging to his body. It's like he's just come out of a shower fully clothed, but I hadn't heard any water running. My stomach drops. This is wrong, so wrong. He moves toward me, and I instinctively step back, bumping into the doorframe. His face is mostly in shadow, but what little I can see is unsettling. He's grinning, but it's not friendly. It's predatory. He reaches out toward me, murmuring, "Come here." I tell him no, ask him to turn on the light, but he refuses, saying he doesn't like the lights on. My hand tightens on the doorknob, and I start pulling the door closed, but he stops it with a firm grip. That's when he grabs me, roughly, and I shove him back, panicking. I'm trembling, saying it was a mistake to come, that I'm leaving. He doesn't back off. Instead, he reaches for me again, and this time, I get a better look at his face. It's not the guy from the photos. This is someone completely different, someone I've never seen in my life. That's it for me. I don't even think. I just step back into the hallway and run. I fly down the stairs, barely touching the steps, throw open the double doors, and bolt out into the street. I don't care about locking anything behind me. I sprint all the way back to my apartment, lights off, doors locked, phone in hand. I blocked him immediately. Heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I've played that night over and over in my head, thinking about what could have happened. I'm done with the apps for now. I made a stupid decision, and it could have ended so much worse. Trust your gut, always. It's not worth the risk.